Okay. Just so you know, people send me a lot of stuff now, and it's hard to sort through it. There's some people I just had to block because of the crazy stuff they send me. Well, today we're going to, for our prophecy update, we're going to continue our series in the strong delusion that seems to be coming on the world. As you know, each week we talk about this convergence of at least the stage setting portion of the end times where these things are beginning to converge. And as they converge, it's going to get my view is that as these things get closer and closer to the return of Christ, this convergence is going to cause a lot of, for lack of a better term, turbulence in the world. And it's going to seem very troubling to those who don't understand what's going on. There'll be some, though, because of the strong delusion, that they'll just think everything is fine, just like there are plenty of people out there right now. So we're going to look at a little bit of an economic update. Then we're going to get into just some of the things that happened the last week that I think indicate that the strong delusion that's coming is already in place and growing in our world today. A lot of economic news this week was not very good. There's quite a bit of economic slowdown. There are people who've noted that shipping rates for various commodities and goods are dropping very precipitously, which means that there's not a lot of economic activity. There was this report in one of the newspapers the other day that this is a dire time for European banks. There's a difference between the American and European banks. The American banks, for the most part, back in 2007 and 2008, were recapitalized. The European banks, though, have not been recapped, which means that when the next economic storm comes, and it's coming if it's not here already, they're going to have to recapitalize, which is going to cause a banking crisis in Europe. The one thing that people are concerned about are what we call bail-ins. That's already been tried in Cyprus, which means that when the banks and the central banks need more money, what they'll do is they'll just take all deposits above a certain amount. So you just need to be aware of those things coming, and you need to be, I don't want to call, the reality of that is that if people figure that that's coming, what's that going to cause? A bank run. And then what happens if there's a bank run? The banks are going to fail. But what happens if they don't if they don't do the bail-in and take the people's money? The banks are going to fail. So there's a real crisis that's coming. The blue chip stocks are down quite a bit. This is a picture from the Wall Street the other day about not only are energy prices going down quite a bit, the blue line there that goes all the way down really far is crude oil, but you also see that copper, steel, and corn are also in decline. So none of those are good signs for the economy. And CNBC this week and some of the other newspapers, they quoted ex-Bank of International Settlement chief economist William White, who warned of an epic debt tsunami worse than 2007. And he was interviewed for some of these articles while he was at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, a couple weeks ago. And here's what the article says. Ahead of the World Economic Forum at Davos, White, and he headed, I think I just mentioned, the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, which is sort of like the central banks of the central bank of the central banks. Ahead of the World Economic Forum at Davos, White underlined the significance of the crisis in China for the world economy. Emerging markets were part of the solution after the Lehman crisis. That's back in 2008. Now they are part of the problem too, he said. Debts have continued to build up over the last 8 years, and they have reached such levels in every part of the world that they have become a potent cause for mischief. It will become obvious in the next recession that many of these debts will never be serviced or repaid. And this will be uncomfortable for a lot of people who think they own assets that are worth something. The situation is worse than it was in 2007. Our macroeconomic ammunition to fight downturns is essentially all used up, White said. The only question is whether we are able to look reality in the eye and face what is coming in an orderly fashion or whether it will be disorderly. And that's one of the leading economists in the world who's saying that sort of thing. So exactly what will happen is anybody's guess. How it will unfold is anybody's guess. These things often will be triggered by sometimes a seemingly innocuous event or economic crisis or something happening, and then all of a sudden the world's in a major recession. But I do think that there's no question but that it's coming. I saw an interesting article yesterday about home prices in Vancouver. And some of you who are realtors in here will appreciate this. Over the last number of years, people are trying to get money out of China. And one of the places they've invested in real estate is Vancouver, British Columbia. And they had pictures of, I would call them hovels, homes that you would not want to live in that had sold for between $2.5 and $6.5 million. I can't remember the newspaper that I saw. The pictures were stunning. This home went for $6.2 million, and what happened? Nobody ever lived in it. And well, what it's done, though, is it's caused home prices to become unaffordable for the average person in Vancouver. And it was Chinese people coming over, some think to launder money, to kind of buy the property, get the money, and just leave, and never take care of it. The properties are falling apart. They have no windows. And some of the, I mean, these homes are $6 million homes. You have to see the pictures to believe it. But suffice it to say, there is, in my view, an economic earthquake of some magnitude coming. Exactly how big, I don't know, but I just think that it's inevitable because all of the fundamentals of the market have been completely upset by the Fed printing money and central banks all over the world just printing money and dumping it into the system. It's going to distort the market at some point. And they've been, I will say this, they've been very clever in keeping ahead of a major economic problem. Speaking of earthquakes, these reports out of Taiwan. It was not an extremely strong earthquake, but it's caused a lot of damage. And last I heard, there were at least a dozen people dead and 100 or more missing from some of these collapsed buildings. This report in the BBC shows that humans think that they're going to build the perfect human. Scientists get the gene editing go-ahead. I think this is something that ultimately I don't think that God will allow. I also saw a report, I think it was a study published in a journal out of Oxford, that said as they're breaking down into the genes, the human genome and the DNA, what they're finding is, guess what? It's way more complicated than they ever thought. And they're finding a complexity in the language that controls the code in the DNA and the genome. And they're finding that it's just why. So when people say that, well, I'm not a scientist, so don't, or a biologist, but don't quote me on it, although I know people will. But people say, well, tapeworms and humans have the same number of genes, or there are only a couple genes difference. But there's a big difference between a tapeworm. For the most part, there's some people who actually act like parasitic tapeworms in their life, but that aside, those few aside, or those many aside, the fact of the matter is there's a very big difference between tapeworms and humans. And the fact that they may have similar number of genes or that type of thing doesn't mean anything. And so what they're finding, though, is in the article quoted, said at the end, as we get into this, it appears that this is bioengineering on a very complex scale. In other words, there's a designer. There's no other way to explain the complexity of human or any other DNA that we find. Everybody thought that the genes, it's sort of like, remember Darwin said, well, the cell was just this kind of mass of goo, and so it could change very quickly. But we find as the cell has these machines in it, very complex structure, they're finding the same thing now. Another thing that I've been kind of keeping track of, this is a picture of the Porter Ranch area of North Los Angeles. You can see Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles there in the distance. They had this massive gas leak. It's the largest gas leak ever on record. And there's been thousands of people have been forced to leave their homes. There's thousands of people who are ill. And this is a pretty heavily, you can see the picture there of the subdivision. It's a very heavily populated area. It's north of the Reagan Freeway in North Los Angeles. So it would be, if you are familiar with LA, it would be east of Simi Valley. It's up not too far from where the Interstate 5 and the 405 join together as Interstate 5 continues to the north. It's, as I said, a very heavily populated area to the south of where this gas leak is. There are reports that the gas company has said that they've lost control of the field. It's the largest natural gas leak in human history. It's a massive underground storage facility that they have, and they don't know what to do. They're trying to find out. There's also been a lot of these reports. This is a volcano in Japan that has been erupting off and on over the last several hundreds of years. It's been relatively dormant lately, at least for the last 10 or 15 years, is my understanding. It erupted, lava flows. There are quite a few volcanoes in the Ring of Fire around the Pacific Ocean. That I think there are 5 of them that are erupting right now, which is a little bit unusual. There were 2 that started erupting a couple weeks ago within hours of each other on the same essential plate. A friend of mine remarked the other day, he said, "You can't tell me that the Almighty isn't trying to send a message to people." And I think that that's the case. So as we get into this period of time, we move closer to this period of time called the 70th week of Daniel. One of the things that, at least this is my understanding, this is the way I've been looking at things recently, is we know that there are these seals that will be open. There are also trumpet judgments. There are bowl judgments. But one of the things that it appears is that these judgments are progressive. The seal opens, and then it eventually reaches a climax. And that's what it's going to be like with this strong delusion. We're going to see, and I don't think there's any question, but that we see the strong delusion operating right now. For example, Rick Joyner, part of the New Apostolic Reformation, Pastor Steve mentioned this in first hour, says that if the Carolina Cougars win today, and you should know that his ministry occupies the old buildings that were built by Jim Baker on the south part of Charlotte, North Carolina, the home city of one of the teams in the Super Bowl tonight. But if the Carolina Cougars win tonight, it's not the Cougars, Panthers. Same species, okay? Get beyond Steelers, that's about it, so for me. The Carolina Panthers win, there will be a great revival. That'll be the beginning of a third great awakening. So I guess Denver, if they want to get with God's plan, needs to throw the game tonight. Here's one prediction. Rick Joyner will be proven to be a false prophet. Okay? Now, I'm not operating in a prophetic capacity there. I'm just stating a fact. He already is a false prophet. He's one of the big promoters of this Todd Bentley nonsense that we see. So, I've got my slides backwards. So, for the mystery of lawlessness, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. So when Paul was writing, this was already happening. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan with all power, signs, and lying wonders. No flesh be saved. I think my slides are all. Verse 10, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this reason, God will send them strong delusion that they should believe the lie, that they all be condemned who did not believe the truth but had pleasure in unrighteousness. And there will be this intervention by God that he sends the strong delusion, but the foundations of that strong delusion will be well in place before the final strong delusion comes. And I think we see that operating on so many levels in our culture today. For example, this is an update on that report that I gave a few weeks ago about the professor at Wheaton who said that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. She was suspended by Wheaton, and you should know that they continue that process. They've tried to reconcile with her, but she does not seem to be teachable, I guess is the best way that I would describe it, based on the reports that I've read. And now the Wheaton faculty, though, has come out, in the faculty council has come out in unanimous support of this lady. Because even though what she says contradicts the Wheaton statement of faith, the faculty at Wheaton says they shouldn't get rid of her. She should be allowed to continue to teach. You just might want to think about Wheaton if you're thinking about sending someone there. But one of the most stunning displays this week of delusion was this. And there's no sound of this video, so you can just watch it. This is the Vatican this week. And they brought in two bodies. One was a guy named Padre Pio. He was a priest, a monk, and they put them in crystal coffins, their bodies. Now, they did fix up the bodies, I'm understanding, with some silicone and that type of things, because, for example, this Padre Pio, the guy you just saw there, has been dead for almost 50 years. So you would expect his body deteriorated some, but they put them in crystal coffins, and they brought them, and they wanted them to get to the Vatican before Ash Wednesday, which is coming up, and there's some part of some jubilee, and so people are going to come and pray to these bodies for a blessing. And this is endorsed by the Pope. And so you see here at the Vatican, and this is a truncated version of the procession. They first brought them into St. Peter's Square, went around the obelisk that was there, placed the bodies out. They essentially had a ceremony, I guess maybe a mass. They sprayed incense, sprinkled the incense or whatever over the bodies. The bodies were then carried into St. Peter's Basilica, taken up to the great altar there, and laid out there in front of the great altar. You can see the two bodies there. And they're supposed to be there in St. Peter's. Whether they're going to move them off to the side or not, I don't know. But those bodies are going to be there for the next year. Now, this Padre Pio, here's what one of the articles says. For 50 years, he bore the marks of Christ. Father Fernandez said, yet the marks disappeared as soon as he died. There were accusations that they were self-inflicted. We're talking about the stigmata that some Catholic mystics have, and this guy was a mystic of the first rank. So he wasn't an ordinary guy. He had special gifts. He could see right into people's hearts, they said. And so here he is. This is the Pope promoting essentially necromancy, something that's clearly forbidden by Scripture. And yet there are thousands of people. But the problem that I have is there are so many evangelicals today that want us to believe that there's no difference between true Christianity and Roman Catholicism. And there is a huge difference. One is true, one is false. But too many people are saying, there's no problem, they worship the same things. Political geopolitics, we have this supposed launch by North Korea of some things into space. The U.S. is threatening sanctions. China's upset about that because they do a lot of business with North Korea. There's also concern that North Korea is testing so that they can send a nuclear missile across the Pacific to the west coast of the United States and engage in an EMP attack where they would sort of bring down our electric grid, or at least the grid of a large part of our country. So that's something to keep aware of. So now I'm going to talk about just a couple other things. And, you know, I have to talk about this. The president this week went to a mosque in Baltimore. It was the first time he supposedly went to a mosque in the United States, or at least officially went to a mosque in the United States. The speech was a stunning display of lying and mischaracterization of history. The president stood in front of these windows, and although they don't show up real well in this particular picture, the windows have Arabic on each of the windows. Now, this mosque in Baltimore is known to have what we would call radical terrorist ties. Some of the radical clerics, I think it's Al-Awlaki, had been taught by people in this mosque. When bin Laden was killed, they eulogized bin Laden at this mosque and said, the cleric at the time, the imam at the time, said that there would be thousands of other bin Ladens raised up because the United States had killed bin Laden. But the one thing that I think is very significant is you see the banner right over the president's head. What that is, my understanding is, I don't read Arabic. I barely read English, as you can tell sometimes. That is the word Allah. And the president had no problem speaking with that behind him. In fact, what I read in one article, and the source I trust, that all of the windows there say Allah. And there are about 99 of them. So behind the president were almost 100 times the word Allah was written. And he had no problem with that. And you remember the president, we've talked a lot about that speech here. He went to Cairo in June 4th, 2009, one of his first major speeches in a foreign country, although he had spoken a couple months before, if you'll remember, in Turkey, spoke to the Turkish parliament. But when he spoke in Cairo, he insisted that the Muslim Brotherhood be invited, despite the fact that that was a banned group by the Egyptian government. And my personal view is that that speech led in very short order to the thing that we now call the 5-year-old Arab Spring and the uprisings across the Arab world. Now, some of you who attended the church here, attended the class I used to teach elsewhere, will remember back in 2009, April of 2009, around the time that he went to Turkey, and about 2 months before he went to Cairo to deliver that speech. And again, I think the June 4th, 2009 speech is one you should go back and read or listen to again, because I think you will see a lot of what this president has done wrapped up in that speech. It's a very significant speech. And I think in a sense, I think it was prophetic. And he made some, I know it's hard for you to believe, but the president made some outlandish claims in that speech about the role of Islam in American history. But less than 2 months before he did the speech in Cairo, he went to Garson Hall at Georgetown University. It's a very common place, and this is what Garson Hall looks like before the president's people take care of things. And you will note above the blue panel, there is a black panel with a cross and the letters IHS. And that's a Greek letter representation of Jesus. That's not what the place looked like, though, when the president spoke, because you see the panel there on the left, the word Jesus, the president's advance team came in and said that the word Jesus had to be covered up. And Georgetown, being the great Jesuit school that it is, said, okay, no problem. Here's another picture. You can see where this IHS is. And it was covered up. Because the president didn't want that behind him when he gave his speech. But now, 7 years later, almost, he goes to a mosque in Baltimore, and the word Allah, he's fine with. Now, I think that speaks volumes about where he's been coming from all this time. As if you shouldn't have realized it already. If there was ever any doubt in your mind where he's coming from, you shouldn't have it anymore. And there are the chairs at the mosque speech reserved for the White House staff, each of which contain or have on them a copy of the Quran. By the way, I haven't looked at the pictures. I know Michelle Obama was there, but a day or two later, he went to the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington, and I don't remember seeing too many of the White House staff there. But they were there at the mosque. Here's just a couple, I promise these are brief clips of what the president had to say. Here's clip one.
The Muslim American community remains relatively small, so several million people in this country.
Well, that's not what he said in the speech in Cairo. He talked about the great numbers of people that's contrary to what he said in Cairo. Here's number two.
We've got to tackle this head on. We have to be honest and clear about it, and we have to speak out. This is a moment when, as Americans, we have to truly listen to each other and learn from each other. And I believe it has to begin with a common understanding of some basic facts. And you know, I express these facts, although they'd be obvious to many of the people in this place, because unfortunately it's not facts that are communicated on a regular basis through our media. So let's start with this fact. For more than 1,000 years, people have been drawn to Islam's message of peace. And the very word itself, Islam, comes from salam, peace. The standard greeting is, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you.
Well, it really means submission. And by the way, somebody wrote on a YouTube comment that I was saying that Islam is a religion of peace and love. I was saying that that's what they try to portray it as. That's what a lot of people believe, but I don't believe that. So if anybody wants to write that again, that's a good way to get yourself permanently blocked from commenting on our YouTube channel, is to make a comment like that. I don't believe that, and if you've listened to anything that we've said around here at FBC over the years, we do not in any way support that religion. We have very negative, strong views of that religion, and we think it plays a very significant role in the end times. And here's the final clip of President Obama.
Jefferson and John Adams had their own copies of the Quran. Benjamin Franklin wrote that even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send a missionary to preach to us, he would find a pulpit at his service. So this is not a new thing. Generations of Muslim Americans helped to build our nation. They were part of the flow of immigrants who became farmers and merchants.
Well, he goes on to talk about, now listen, Islam did play some significant roles in the history of the United States. Every time you hear the Marine hymn, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, it will tell you why Adams and Jefferson had a copy of the Quran. Because they wanted to understand what it was driving these Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean to take Americans hostage and sell them into slavery. And we created the Marines to deal with that. That's the role that it played in American history, among other things. Well, the president's speech, you can read it, you can watch it. I'm not going to play any more of it. But he had can I get an amen? A couple days later, or a day or two later, he went to the National Prayer Breakfast. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind, the president said in his remarks. He said this, I pray that our leaders will always act with humility and generosity. I pray that my failings are forgiven. I pray that we will uphold our obligation to be good stewards of God's creation, this beautiful planet. I pray that we will see every single child as our own, each worthy of our love and of our compassion. And I pray we answer Scripture's call to lift up the vulnerable and to stand up for justice and ensure that every human being lives in dignity, including maybe Mr. President, all the Christians that have been slaughtered and persecuted and beheaded and crucified in the Middle East that you've never mentioned. The White House is looking into it on a legal standpoint as to whether they can call that genocide, what's going on in the Middle East. They're not comfortable with that conclusion yet. That's why they haven't said anything, they say. It's just a lie. The king of lies. I'm just stunned at the things that I see. This is important, though, because of what's going on in our culture and the delusion that's coming in at many, many different levels that you need to watch out for in your local community. And people who are watching online, you need to find out, what are kids in my school being taught? Here's an example, Charles County Schools in Maryland, the state where he went to speak in the mosque in Baltimore. In the same state, a U.S. Marine has sued a Maryland school district for forcing his daughter to recite the Islamic profession of faith in history class. Schools across the nation are forcing such Islamic indoctrination. This is from Investor's Business Daily. I think it's tomorrow's edition, or it was just a day or two ago. Listen to what this article says. It's on the editorial page. The Maryland district requires that students write out and confess the Shahada, the Islamic profession of faith, which states there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. However, the school district does not require students to recite the Ten Commandments, the Beatitudes, or John 3:16. The district, in fact, mandates that teachers spend only one day teaching Christianity while devoting 2 weeks to promoting Islam. This is fact. Charles County Public Schools also teach the following. Most Muslims' faith is stronger than the average Christian. Islam at heart is a peaceful religion. Allah is the same God that is worshipped in Christianity and Judaism. It sounds like they got a lot of students that could get right into Wheaton. Islamic fundamentalists are opposed to Western imperialist pursuits. Muhammad was a businessman and trader who forgave people who opposed him. Well, he did. He forgave a group of Jews, and then he cut off the heads of all the men and put the women into slavery, sex slavery. Other things they teach, Muhammad was a businessman and trader. I always said that. Allah is the source of authority. This is what the kids are being taught. Muslim scholars preserved and expanded much of scientific knowledge. Muslims acted kindly to those they conquered. They did, as long as they submitted and they paid the tax, the very high taxes that were enacted. The editorial continues, talk about historic revisionism. The unit shamelessly sugarcoats the systematic Muslim beheadings of conquered Jews and pagans in Medina and Mecca under Muhammad's reign. In fact, the correct answer to test question number 18, question, how did the Muslim conquerors treat those they conquered, is, the correct answer is, with tolerance, kindness, and respect. The high school, which uses the Islam-endorsing textbook World History Survey, Patterns of Interaction, you ought to write that down, World History Survey, Patterns of Interaction, and see if that's being used in your school, would let Wood's daughter, that's the Marine who brought the suit, opt out of the assignments and threaten her with failing grades if she didn't do them. So she couldn't opt out of those assignments. When she refused, it stuck her in the library and flunked her for the unit. So Wood, who was banned by the school for complaining, sued in federal court, charging that the public school district is unconstitutionally promoting the Islamic faith. Parents should know that this unconstitutional promotion of Islam, along with the marginalization, even denigration of Christianity, is happening in public schools across the country as part of President Obama's Common Core curriculum. Similar cases have been reported recently in Minnesota, as well as even conservative states such as Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. Project Veritas recently caught on camera a former marketing executive for textbook publishing giant Pearson Education revealing the anti-Christian, pro-Islamic agenda of Common Core. Veritas, quote, Christianity is totally out of Common Core, unquote. Ex-Pearson official Kim Kober, yes it is, totally. It's not a core concept at all. They said you have to talk about Islam. Parents must be ever vigilant. This is Richard Thomas of the Thomas More Law Center. Parents must be ever vigilant to the Islamic indoctrination of their children under the guise of teaching history and multiculturalism. This is happening in public schools across the country, and they must take action to stop it. And they were the ones who brought suit for the Woods. If more parents fail to fight back like the courageous Wood, they risk their children not being indoctrinated, but possibly even being converted to Islam in our otherwise secular public schools. It's a stunning problem. This refugee or the situation in Syria continues to spiral out of control. Here's a short video. This video is taken of the city of Homs. It's about 100 miles or so north of Damascus. It was the third most populous city in Syria when the war started back, the civil war started back in early 2011. These pictures are just stunning in the level of destruction in this city, a city about the size of the city of Columbus. This is why everybody's leaving Syria. It's been destroyed, effectively destroyed. The major cities look like this in great part. It's a Russian drone company that took these pictures. Just stunning levels of destruction. And we know there are a lot of prophecies about the destruction of Damascus and that type of thing. And a lot of Damascus looks like this already. This is Homs, not Damascus. But you know, when we talk about the destruction of Damascus, it's sort of like, well, it's not going to take much to make it a ruinous heap. You know, just a little bit more will finish the job. And this is what city after city in Syria looks like. Just stunning images. Now you know why everybody's left. Over half the country doesn't live where they used to live just 5 years ago. Stunning pictures. And the European Union, this report today, EU's passport fraud is epidemic. The refugee crisis and Paris attacks put the spotlight on Europe's free-for-all. Greece and Italy troubles U.S. officials the most. So some of our security officials are troubled by fake passports coming out of Europe. Why? Because the people can come in here on a fake passport. It's bad enough that this is the report that was issued this week. In the aftermath of Paris, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security became so worried about the implications for screening travelers to America that it gave France, Belgium, Germany, Italy, and Greece a February 1st deadline to fix crucial loopholes or lose access to the U.S. visa waiver program. The program allows about 20 million people per year from 38 countries, most of them in Europe, to enter the United States for business or pleasure without a visa. And this report from Interpol shows lost and stolen travel documents from 2010 to 2015 and look at the numbers, the gray bar at the bottom, in 2015, there were nearly 60 million lost or stolen travel documents worldwide. That's a lot. In Europe, it was over 30 million lost or stolen travel documents. And so this passport fraud, and that's how one of the bombers or one of the shooters got into Paris to do what they did back in November. The Institute for Study of War and American Enterprise Institute put out a report, criticalthreats.org. You can download the report and read it. I'm going to read a fair amount of this today because I think it shows some of the problems that we have in our culture with delusion. And our leaders are deluded about this Islamic problem. So they have an executive summary. It's about a 50-page document. But I want you to listen to this. I want you to think about Bible prophecy, the fact that, you know, a lot of it's centered around Israel and the Middle East, and the prophecies are there. And I just want you to kind of listen to what this says through that framework. So here's what it said. This is in the executive summary. Salafi jihadi military organizations, particularly ISIS and Al-Qaeda, are the greatest threat to the security and values of American and European citizens. By the way, I don't think these people are going to be invited to the White House or to the mosque in Baltimore. ISIS and Al-Qaeda pose an existential threat because they accelerate the collapse of world order, provoke domestic and global trends that endanger American values and way of life, and plan direct attacks against the U.S. and its partners. So they accelerate the collapse of world order, they provoke domestic and global trends that endanger the American values and way of life, and they plan direct attacks against the U.S. and its partners. ISIS and Al-Qaeda are more than terrorist groups, they are insurgencies. They use terrorism as a tactic, but these organizations are insurgencies that aim first to overthrow all existing governments in the Muslim world and replace them with their own, and later to attack the West from a position of power to spread their ideology to all of humanity. So, you know, imagine Israel living right in the midst of this. But this report says this is a much bigger problem than just Middle East. This is a worldwide global problem. Separating the elements of ISIS and Al-Qaeda that are actively working to attack the West from the main bodies of those groups fighting in the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia is impossible. In other words, what they're saying is they're all part of a piece. All Al-Qaeda groups and ISIS affiliates seek to take the war into the West to fulfill their grand strategic objective of establishing a global caliphate, albeit according to different timelines. Counter-ISIS and Al-Qaeda policies do not ensure the safety of the American people or the homeland. The primary objective, what they did was they essentially sat down and they war gamed it with a bunch of experts. And these are the conclusions that they reach after examining the data that they collectively looked at. The primary objective of the U.S. government remains protecting the homeland and the American people, including safeguarding American values both in the homeland and abroad. The activities of ISIS and Al-Qaeda interact with the policies of Russia, Iran, and China to endanger the international systems upon which American safety and freedom depend. Any strategy to counter ISIS and Al-Qaeda will require coalition partners. However, there is no natural coalition of states with common goals that can readily work together to resolve the problem. Translation, they're organized around a common goal, we're not. And if you want to say, are we in the U.S. organized around a common goal, I would submit to you is watch the debates of the different parties. It's like they live on different planets. American and Western security requires the elimination of ISIS and Al-Qaeda regional bases and safe havens. Salafi jihadi groups, these are coming out essentially out of the Middle East. Salafi jihadi groups, independent of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, form a base of support from which the enemy draws strength and resilience. ISIS and Al-Qaeda use the extensive safe haven and infrastructure of locally focused Salafi jihadi groups to help plan, train, and equip fighters for the attacks against the West. And what are some of those safe havens? Mosques, that promote this ideology. Destroying the specific cells or nodes actively preparing attacks against the West is not sufficient. Al-Qaeda and ISIS will be able to reconstitute the threat as long as Salafi jihadi military organizations continue to support them. They then went and they summarized the areas. The black areas are ISIS, the brown areas are Al-Qaeda, and the areas that they have under influence. And look at Africa, look at Northern Africa and what's happened there. And look at the black area along the coast there of Libya, a major oil producing region. They then go on to give sort of their conclusions, and they talk about things, and I think this is where the delusional part comes in a lot. Pervasive mixed characterizations of the challenge. In other words, people in our government, security apparatus, mischaracterize the problem because they're deluded. They don't think it's a problem. The current discussion of these attacks is cementing fundamental mischaracterizations of the national security problem. However, it presupposes that there is a single war, that ISIS is the only enemy or adversary in that war, and that defeating ISIS in Syria and Iraq is tantamount to defeating the organization as a whole. It has given these mischaracterizations have had these results. It's given superficial credibility to Russian President Vladimir Putin's call for a grand coalition of all major powers to unite in the fight against ISIS. It largely ignores Al-Qaeda. It also downplays the importance of the sectarian war that has engulfed the Middle East. That sectarian conflict is one of the primary drivers of the massive flow of refugees now undermining the integration of Europe, facilitating the destruction of multiple states in the Middle East, such as Iraq and Yemen, and encouraging the mobilization and radicalization of global Sunni and Shia populations in the face of what increasing numbers of people perceive to be existential threats. Any effort to counter the Al-Qaeda and ISIS threats will fail as long as conditions on the ground do not change. Other problems. The media's and policymakers' single-minded focus on ISIS encourages Americans to overlook the fundamental incompatibility of Iranian and Russian regional and global objectives with those of the U.S. and Europe. Such a narrow lens ignores Russia's revisionist grand strategy that links Moscow's actions in Syria with its continued war in Ukraine, its subversive global activities in the Baltics, and its mounting global military aggression. And I'm reading a lot of Christian prophecy websites that are talking about the great Christian Vladimir Putin and how Russia is the last bastion for protecting Christianity. And I'm just saying, as Russia has long had, at the height of the Cold War, they had 1 million people whose job was to engage in disinformation and propaganda. So I don't trust much of what I hear out of there. It simplifies an extremely complicated set of multi-actor, multi-theater conflicts into a problem that can be solved through counterterrorism targeting and homeland security measures, like taking your shoes off at the airport. It guarantees that the West will not design or execute a coherent strategy to secure its vital national interest. I'm going to leap ahead to the conclusion of this. It talks about all the different problems that have happened, the symptoms of the collapsing world. This sounds like a John Haller prophecy update. The symptoms of the collapsing world order have appeared already. The promises of the Arab Spring have largely failed states. ISIS has overrun the borders of Iraq and Syria. Russia has annexed border provinces in Ukraine. Refugees and migrants have overwhelmed Europe and collapsed the Schengen zone. That's the zone where you could travel without visas or passports between countries. Iran has fired missiles in the Straits of Hormuz. China has built islands to allow it to project power. And North Korea has tested a nuclear weapon. The collapse of world order creates the vacuums that allow Salafi jihadi military organizations such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS to amass resources to plan and conduct attacks on scales that could overwhelm any defenses that the United States might raise. Even a marginal increase in such attacks could provoke Western societies to impose severe controls on the freedoms and civil liberties of their populations that would damage the very ideals that must most be defended. Sound strategy against these enemies requires effective action against their bases as well as appropriate domestic efforts. It's not a very optimistic report, but I think it's very realistic. We have a major problem. And this problem is, along with a number of other problems that we talk about here in our prophecy updates, is collapsing the world geopolitical order. Now, what's the end result of that? I think it leads to somebody who's going to come on the scene to at least make people think that he's got the solution to the problems. And Paul talks about that in 2 Thessalonians. The mystery of iniquity is already at work. It's going to reach its apex at the middle point of the 70th week when Satan directly possesses this individual. Then all bets are off. But the headlines this week, we see here this Islamic State exploits a divided Libya, reports of this continuing exodus. There's a major offensive by Russia and Syrian troops, the Assad Syrian government troops, against Aleppo and northern Syria, with the result that just this week, 70,000 people picked up and went to the Turkish border to leave Syria. 70,000. It's not an inconsequential number. Now, the EU is trying to slow the flow of migrants. They've said they're going to deport people. And my point is, I'll believe that when I see it. Sweden says they're going to deport 80,000 people. The same Sweden where a young lady was working in a group home where a number of unaccompanied minors, all males, were residing in southern Sweden. There was a dispute. She got stabbed to death. So what did the chief of police say? What did the prime minister of Sweden say? Well, we need to understand where these people are coming from. There was really no, people in Sweden are mad because the government and the police didn't really express any sympathy to these parents who had lost a daughter. In the Wall Street Journal yesterday, it says, oh yeah, by the way, guess what? Jihad comes to Africa. And the headline says, it could become the worst part on the planet, the jihadist growth in Africa. Africa's Muslim belt is getting bloodier. Boko Haram, the regional affiliate of Islamic State and one of the world's deadliest terrorist groups, has accelerated its campaign of almost daily suicide bombings. This is in Nigeria. Just last month, the group massacred 86 people, many of them children, in the Nigerian village of Dalari, and 32 others in the Cameroonian village of Bodo. Africa is now crisscrossed by war zones stretching from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic. You don't hear much about it. Thus far, the rivalry between Islamic State and Al-Qaeda has kept these insurgencies separate, but that may not last. Meanwhile, the operations of these African militant groups have become increasingly sophisticated, often thanks to the expertise and advice shared by their patrons and allies in the Middle East. Widespread internet access and increasingly easy travel, using, guess what? Fake travel documents, have made these connections far simpler than just a decade ago. And Europe is in a major economic crisis, and how are they going to afford to fight this? It's, in my view, it's the perfect prophetic storm. It really is. Economic, geopolitical, actors in place, all of those things. Melanie Phillips, I'll close with this. She wrote a great article in the Jerusalem Post on Friday called "Those Nice Israeli Bashers' Achilles Heels." Now, first of all, we know that this week at the Damascus Gate, a lot of us have been there. It's a very busy area. It's one of the main entrances to the old city. And outside the Damascus Gate, 3 young Palestinian men came up and started shooting. Now, listen, they weren't stabbing, they were shooting. They had pipe bombs on them, and a border guard, a young 19-year-old woman, stepped into the fray. That's their job. They were shot, and one of them died, 19 years old. But look how that was reported in the press by, say, oh, such a great unbiased news organization as CBS News. This is the headline that first appeared on CBS News before the one border security guard had died. 3 Palestinians killed as daily violence grinds on. Al Jazeera, they sounded like Al Jazeera because Al Jazeera said 3 Palestinians shot and killed by Israeli police at Damascus Gate and occupied East Jerusalem. Well, that didn't set well with a lot of people. They confronted CBS, and so CBS, using the same timestamp, changed the thing to Palestinians kill Israeli officer, wound another before being killed. That's a little bit better, but it still doesn't speak to the problem. And it says right there, 3 Palestinians armed with automatic weapons, explosive devices, and knives killed an Israeli security officer. And then, so this was yet another one of these scenes of by all respects, a wonderful young woman laid to rest in Jerusalem. You see her parents sitting there, and then you'll see her father get up and give a impassioned eulogy for his daughter. And he said, "I salute you." 19 years old, gone. With some of her friends and fellow guards, border security people. So this is happening almost daily in Israel. Rights groups in Al Jazeera said this: French police abuse Muslims under emergency laws. Because they're going into mosque and they're finding weapons caches and that type of thing, support systems. There's another report just from yesterday or today. Jerusalem Post, 2 Arab girls knife a Romley security guard. 1 suspect carried knife in the school backpack. And the question posed was this: is this starting another armed intifada? Ban Ki-moon, by the way, I played a clip of him last week, who said, well, we understand this because of the occupation. So what did he do? He was called on it by Benjamin Netanyahu, and so did Ban Ki-moon repent and say he was sorry for getting this all messed up? No, he wrote an editorial in the New York Times, "Don't shoot the messenger, Israel." So this is what we can expect in this world. Back to Melanie Phillips' article, and I'll close with this. Why can't Israel's self-styled friends understand that the things they say about Israel are not, in fact, the sentiments of friends, but of enemies? Whenever someone says, as a friend, candid friend, staunch ally of Israel, you know that what's coming is a vicious kick to the head, delivered, of course, purely in a spirit of friendship. Melanie Phillips is the English, she lives in England, she's Jewish, but so she's the English version of Caroline Glick. The Canadian Foreign Minister, Stéphane Dion, described himself as a steadfast ally and friend to Israel, criticized both the Palestinians' unilateral pursuit of statehood and the Israeli settlement construction. Canada is concerned, he said, by the continued violence in Israel and the West Bank. Canada calls for all efforts to be made to reduce violence and incitement and to help build the conditions for a return to the negotiating table. Dion seems to be suggesting that Israeli terrorism victims were somehow asking for it, and that Palestinian murder attacks were to be equated with Israeli self-defense. Doubtless he thought he was being studiously even-handed and therefore fair, wise, and just. But in the battle between victim and aggressor, legality and illegality, truth and falsehood, even-handedness inescapably entails blaming the victim and tacitly endorsing illegality and lies. A few days later, UN Secretary General did something similar. While condemning the current wave of Palestinian stabbings and other attacks upon Israelis, he claimed the perpetrators were driven by alienation and despair. It is a human nature to react to occupation, which often serves as a potent incubator of hate and extremism, he said. Bond's apparently real bewilderment that anyone could possibly think he supports terrorism arises from 2 things. The first is his fundamentally false view that the Arab war against Israel. The occupation does not cause Palestinian violence. It is unending Palestinian violence that prolongs the occupation. The Palestinians are driven by despair at the absence of their state. How can this be so when they have turned down repeated offers of such a state since the 1930s? This is not an occupation in the normally accepted understanding of the word. Israel has not occupied other people's land because the disputed territories never belonged to another people. Nor is Israel there out of an aggressive colonial impulse. The Jews are entitled to hold and settle the territories under international law several times over, both as a legally permitted defense against continuous belligerence and from their never abrogated entitlement to do so, as the only people for whom this was ever their national homeland under the terms of the Palestine Mandate. To the West, these Jewish victims of terrorism just don't exist. At the same time, the Western media never report the near daily Palestinian incitement of the mass murder of Israeli Jews. That doesn't fit the narrative of the Palestinian victims of Israel. For identical reasons, the media also ignores the victimization of Palestinians by other Palestinians. According to Palestinian Media Watch, last year the Palestinian Independent Commission for Human Rights received 292 complaints of torture, maltreatments, and physical assault in the West Bank and 928 in the Gaza Strip. Israel is not in the Gaza Strip unless they go in there to clean house. The West remains almost totally ignorant of the tyrannical abuse Palestinians inflict upon one another, but why is its Palestinian narrative thus hermetically sealed against the truth? Then she says this, here's the second reason for Bond's bewilderment. Progressives subscribe to universalizing agendas. These by definition deny any hierarchy of cultures or moral values. So Palestinian society cannot, in other words, equality, right? Everyone's the same, all cultures are the same. Who are we to judge? So Palestinian society cannot be held to innately hostile to human rights, and Palestinian terrorism is equated at best with Israeli defense against such attacks. Thus, on Holocaust Remembrance Day, of all things, Bond equated anti-Semitism with anti-Muslim bigotry, but the two are not remotely comparable. Of course, there are some who are rationally bigoted against Muslims, but most anti-Islamic feeling is a rational response to Islamic violence and aggression. By contrast, anti-Jewish hatred is true bigotry, as it is based entirely on lies, myths, and paranoid and deranged beliefs about Jews who have never posed an aggressive threat to anyone. Bond and others committed to the universalism think this equation is fair. In fact, it diminishes Jew hatred and sanitizes Islamic aggression, which is why progressives who think they are pure because their hearts so conspicuously bleed for the oppressed are not pure at all. They are morally corrupt. They aren't driven by compassion for any kind of victim. What drives them instead is hatred of supposed victimizers in the powerful West. Their purported even-handedness thus camouflages a moral degeneracy. And then this accompanying, this was in Investors Business Daily the other day, Why Socialism Isn't a Bugaboo for Millennials by Catherine Rampol. They have op-eds. This is somebody writing on the left. In the Iowa caucuses alone, so listen to this. This is a stunning number. 84%, Sanders beat Clinton 84% to 14% in this age group, according to entrance polls. That's a 70-point margin. Just for reference, note that in 2008, in the very same state, Iowa, among the very same demographic, Barack Obama bested Clinton by only 46 points. Now it's 70. For a communist, a rank socialist, whatever you want to call it. And Obama was young and cool. Sanders is more of an eccentric grandpa type. The first is that to millennials, Sanders socialism is a feature, not a bug. Much of the conversation about Sanders' democratic socialism is predicated on whether Americans can look past the supposedly toxic label. But millennials love Sanders not despite his socialism, but because of it. Socialism has, and this is a person on the left writing this, socialism has never been a dirty word for the current cohort of youth who either didn't live through the Cold War or don't remember it. We are more likely to associate socialism with prosperous, egalitarian, relatively well-functioned Scandinavian states. Go take a trip to Sweden and run one of those group homes, I would suggest to her and others. Places that produce awesome things like IKEA and the girl with the dragon tattoo, and with autocrats who starve their people. In a recent YouGov survey, 43% of respondents under age 30 said they had a favorable opinion of socialism, while just 32% said the same about capitalism. Stunning numbers, just absolutely stunning numbers. So back to Melanie Phillips, I'm almost done. While denouncing Israel, they support Palestinians who throw gays from the tops of tall buildings, talking about progressives, who abuse women and children, who jail, torture, and kill dissidents. They support the racist ethnic cleansing of Jews from a future state of Palestine. They help incite false grievances that kill. They have the blood of innocents on their hands. I showed you the gay rights protest against a gay rights organization from Israel last week just because they're Jews. But they think of themselves as fair, decent, and progressive. This is where they are vulnerable. For like Bond, they also tend to be remarkably thin-skinned. That's because their image of themselves really is all that matters to them. They don't care about the world's victims. They care about being seen to care. They think of themselves as nice people. We have to show them that they are not. Self-regard is everything to them. It is therefore their Achilles heel. We should puncture it. And this plays into so much of what we talked about the end times, because remember, talked about false prophet, Antichrist coming, and the Antichrist will use this the religion of the false prophet, but he'll destroy it too. But he keeps the false prophet around, and I've suggested to you that if you just sort of war gamed, I guess, or prophetic gamed the current environment with this socialistic world leaders and a socialistic pope, it's very easy to see how this will play out. And this is something that I don't think has ever been set up this way in history. We have world leaders who use religion as a prop. We have a pope who uses his supposed Christianity as a prop to further a leftist agenda. This is a perfect stage setting for these events to unfold. And so I just encourage you is you've got to stay in the Word. You've got to stay focused. You've got to look at these things going on through a biblical perspective, or it'll drive you crazy. It really will. There are days when, Pam will tell you, there are days when it's just like, I want to get on a plane and fly someplace far away and pretend like everything is okay. But we can't do that. God will get us through this. But fortunately, we have the ability to understand the things that are going on. So let's pray. Father, again, we're so grateful for your prophetic word. And Lord, we just pray like Daniel that as difficult as these times may seem, we just pray that you will fulfill your prophetic word exactly as your prophets predicted to your glory. And Lord, we pray that we will do all that we do to your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.